Welcome to Let's Get Writing. I'm Kathryn Musseau, your host. This show is about the process of writing. Actually, it could be anything. Today it's going to be a little more about writing books. But if you have something in your heart that you'd like to get onto paper, we hope that this show is going to be an avenue for you to get ideas, find out what's worked for other people, what might work for you. And today's guest has so much to share. I'd like to welcome Carolyn R. Parsons. Hey, welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you, Kathryn.
And you are, actually, we have to tell our story.
We have to tell the story, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Well, I met you, and you said you were originally from Change Island.
Right.
Islands, and your name was Parsons.
Right.
Which led me to say that my grandmother was a Parsons from Change Islands. Are we related?
And if you're a Parsons from Change Islands, yes, because there's one family, just one family, big family, but all the Parsons from Change Islands came from one ancestor.
Yeah.
And so we figured it out, and I think it's our great-great-grandfather we share.
We share.
Yeah.
Which I had no idea, and we're not a really broad family, so I'm really happy to know you.
Yeah, well, you got lots of cousins.
I have all kinds of cousins I don't know.
Well, on the Parsons side, in my family, you have, counting me, 32 cousins.
Wow.
So,
and in my family, I don't know, you probably have like 2 or 3.
There you go.
Not that bad, but it's really great. It was really great to meet you, and that was through a project you were doing for the anniversary, the 150th anniversary of Canada.
Right.
And it was a literary tour that I was involved with.
That's right. Yeah.
But
that was last summer.
That was last summer, and this is now. But we have some of your books on the table, but I think I'd like to start by just, other than establishing that you were originally from Change Islands, where are you now, and where do you live and write?
I live in Lewisport. I've been in Lewisport. It'll be 6 years on the 1st of December.
And that's where you are doing all your work right now?
Right now. I work out of the house. I write. I do all kinds of stuff, but I'm home-based. Yep. Yep.
So do you call yourself a full-time writer, Carolyn? Is this something that you are totally dedicated to?
Yeah, it's my main, right now, for the past year, for sure. It is probably put in full-time hours in either writing or something related to my writing, editing, revising, something, or marketing, or all of the pieces of it. So in some fashion. So writing, I do have other things that I do, but writing is
the primary job now.
Yeah.
And was this something that was always part of your life growing up, or how did you come to writing? I always like to ask.
I think I was always a reader. I can't remember not reading. So either I learned really, really early, or I have a really bad memory. But it was really early. And my father was an avid reader. There, books were everywhere, newspapers, and it's something to do when you have a busy mind and you're in a small place like Change Islands, which, it's a wonderful place to grow up, but you have to find your own entertainment. Mm-hmm. And so it was very, sort of a bunch of us that were sort of creative. We would have plays and we would write them, and we used the old store loft to have performances. We did all sorts of things, and I always wrote stories, I wrote poetry. I wrote a full-size book when I was 16, and someone read it, and it made them cry, which was good, because you want to, oh, wow, there's a little bit of power in this, it evokes emotion. And so I've always written in some fashion. Even when I worked, I was in Ontario for 25 years. And of course there's a writing element. I was in business, so there's a writing element, but it's not creative writing. I still wrote poetry, and so I've always written in some fashion. But it wasn't until around 2009 that I started really writing creatively.
But you were drawn to it your whole life, obviously.
Yes,
and I think that is so with a lot of people who take on writing and as a career, or at least start to write books, that it was always somehow a part of it. And you did mention growing up on Change Islands that, there wasn't everything these days and probably even there now, there's not always everything that you can have your hands on in a city. So you create more of your own entertainment. It's not a bad thing to be in an environment like that.
No. And if I think back on it, when other people were going to formal programs and learning, say, drama, we were actually from scratch gathering costumes and doing it ourselves. So we were producing it as well. You know, we weren't just writing the play or acting in it or at someone else. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't things we could have learned, but we certainly did it from the bottom up and got really creative about props and what you could use, and you know. And sometimes we would find plays and perform the actual thing. And I think there's a tradition of that in small places in Newfoundland, where, you know, you go now and they're doing skits and a lot of comedy. But we did some serious things too. I remember we produced a play. Here they put off a play. In other places you put on a play. But we did a play called The Still Alarm, which is an actual real play. And we took roles and rehearsed it and produced and performed it.
Very interesting.
So, and we were, you know, kids, teenagers, maybe young, 10, 11, 12 to 14 maybe.
Yeah. Well, it's a very, very nice way to begin. And actually, it's a very similar path to what I did. I was involved with very close friends, and that's what we did, was theater and story hour at the libraries. And speaking of libraries, another important thing, or I don't want to call it a thing really, but a very important part of a community that we hope we continue to keep.
I'm a huge supporter of the libraries. I grew up in the library, you know, when you're in a small place and you're finding your books, you know, free books. What could be better than free books? And, you know, the library on Change Islands now is not how it always was. I mean, you know, it started in the 40s by a teacher that came down and decided this place needs a library. So he wrote Americans and said, there's a small community in Newfoundland where I'm teaching, and it doesn't have a library. And so all the Americans, you know, donated books. So he left, he finished his year and went back home. And then he got a call that all these books, those packages had shown up from, it was hundreds of books for the Change Islands Library, and he was no longer there. So he had to collect all these books and take them down. But it's a wonderful story, and from that, there's always been a library on Change Islands. And so that's where I spent my days, you know, looking for free books.
Well, it's a beautiful story, and actually maybe should be a story. Maybe you'll write that one. Maybe you will. And here we have some of your books, and you have quite a few books. I just finished reading both of these, actually, and enjoyed them immensely. But you also, in addition to your novels, which are really quite detailed, and, you know, they're not short. I mean, they must have taken incredible amounts of time. You're also a poet. So talk a little bit about what you write and why you write it.
Well, poetry is probably my first love. And in fact, this book has poetry in it. It's my first love. This was my first book, actually, which was a collection of poetry that I had written over time. This wasn't written to be published in a book. It was written for me. A lot of it's about, you know, raising families, and even though it may not say, but a lot of it came from Change Islands. I would come home from Ontario and spend a couple of weeks and would go back and write so much poetry, just inspired by the natural environment. And just all of those things, just, you know, it's just so rich with inspiration for poetry. And it's something, I have 4 children. So poems can be very short. So you can write a poem in between a busy life. It's something you can do. And so I'm still able to write. I've got hundreds and hundreds of poems. I mean, I've got one book, but hundreds and hundreds of them.
And it's I have never given much thought to writing poetry, and I'm sure we could do a whole show on how writing poetry is different from writing a novel. I mean, it's much sparse, much. You have so few words to work with,
right?
You know, and you have to put that together and convey your thoughts. I would almost think, as I speak of it, that it would be more challenging to write than a novel.
It's challenging because what I would write would be the first draft, but then it could take 2 years of looking at it and picking it up. And I could probably open this book now and take one of those poems and fix it and rewrite it and change it. You can change one word in a poem and completely change the meaning of the poem or what you're trying to convey. I've done poetry, even recently I wrote a poem, and I really liked it, and it was like, I like this poem, and maybe someday I'll publish it. And then I thought, wonder if it was in first person. And I completely flipped it. And I'm like, wow, like that completely changes. Now, you can do that with a book, but it would take you forever.
Forever.
Right? But with poetry, you can play those little games and really have fun with the words. But it can be challenging to try to tell a story or, you know, convey something in a very short, you know, these are very short poems, very short. But again, you can start something really quick. You know, something you can, they come from a line or a word or a phrase or something you see or just a thought, and you write it down, and eventually you can build something around it, and it can be as big or small as you want.
Yeah,
so,
poetry is rather
Yeah.
unique that way,
Yeah.
and I liked the way that you wove it into this book. It was very, very nice that you blended two of your loves into one book. And so you take like the Secrets of Rare Moon Tickle. Did it take a while to write that book? Was that your first novel?
Okay, so this book, from the time I started it until it was drafted, took me 6 months.
Well, you know, Carolyn, you know, 6 months actually is not a bad time frame for writing a book.
Yeah, but the story in this book was with me for probably about 20 years. I kind of knew the character, the female character, and the male character. But there were a couple of things that really set me going and really made me want to get started on the story and put it on paper finally. And the first thing that happened was that the person that I was loosely basing the male character on, he passed away tragically in an accident. And so that was one thing that happened, and it was very, very sad. And you know, I'd always wanted to write a story based on him, and you know, I thought, you know, time's short sometimes, you need the reminders. And then the second thing that happened was my youngest daughter finally went to junior kindergarten, and so I had a block of time where I could actually write. So I took my mornings when she was at school, and that's when I started drafting this novel. I really didn't know what I was doing at the time. I knew the story, but how a book should lay out and the chapters and how to make it work, I didn't know, but I just kept going. I wrote every morning. I was very dedicated and disciplined, and I drafted the book. I'm a fast typer, so that helps. And drafted the book over, you know, the course of a couple of months, and it was around 130,000 words, which is sizable.
It's very sizable.
It's sizable.
Yeah, in terms of publishing.
Yes, very much so. And it was too big, really. And so when I started looking at publishing it, that's when we really went down to how can we make this more manageable. And it was actually my choice, because as I'm working through it and doing rewrites, I'm thinking, this is so big. And it's so, like, you forget half the story before you know what you do. You're reading along and you forgot the first 2 chapters. You don't know what you've written about. So I actually basically plucked out the middle, which was her university career, and thought, I know all about that, and it's sort of backstory. Maybe what I need to do is just take that out, divide the book into part 1 and part 2, and I pretty much said, you know, she graduated university with this degree.
Oh, there you go, Carolyn. You're killing me, because we write all this stuff and then we can replace it with one sentence.
Really can. Like, you know, talk about poetry, right?
But it's true. And so many times they say, like, kill your darlings. You're married to your story in your book and you think it's essential, but then you have to put on these other glasses and read it and just go, really, is it essential?
It really
that's
is.
it. That's we're getting to the editing process.
And that is the editing process. It started, that was when I was rewriting. So I had written a draft, and it was huge. And then I'm going through it. And so it made the rewriting so much harder, because I'm rewriting 130,000 words. So when I cut back, the finished product is about 99,000, which is still a nice size book. It's the biggest book. I probably won't write a book as big as that anymore. But it was what I needed to do to tell that story. This story also spans about 20 years. It starts when she's young and goes through her life.
So all challenging pieces in a story. And you know, I think of things like continuity. There's always continuity in TV programs and so on. There's continuity in writing and keeping certain facts and things there. So time spans can make even that more challenging.
It was so challenging because it went from 1984, 85 to 2004. think about technology.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the 1984, 85, 86, you know, the early part of the book, which I think it's 84, I'm not sure. I can't remember what year it was now.
We weren't even we were just getting our first computers coming up around shortly after that.
They were, you know, in Kitchener, and they were using payphones.
Yeah.
And then in 2004, she's using a cell phone. But the cell phone she was using in 2004, if I had continued this story, it would have been like from 2004 to 2018. It's crazy, right? So that is a huge challenge, and it required research because I had to look up. For example, there's a scene at the Royal York Hotel in Toronto in this book. And I've been to the Royal York, but not in 1980-something.
Yeah.
So I had to research what it actually looked like because it had been completely redone. So I looked up old pictures just to be able to describe it a little bit.
Sure. And I think that's one of the challenges, too.
Very challenging.
When you're going back in time. Forward in time, I like to say, well, who knows?
It's speculative.
So that's right.
That's right.
But when you go back, there'll be someone who'll know. And
Always.
You do your best, but you can't hit the ball out of the park every time. But you have to try.
I think as long as you stay within the realm of possibility, that you're pretty good. And if you don't know, leave it vague.
There's good advice.
Just leave it, because sometimes that doesn't matter. But I found out what I could. I found out what I could, and I did what I could with it. And so, that was a bit of a challenge. You have to do that. You have to be consistent. You have to have pacing. You have to make sure that the language of the time suits that time, and the TV show that they're watching is a TV show from that time, and then go forward. And but the advantage of it is that it's supposed to be dated. So some of that's a contemporary fiction. You try to avoid, if you want it to stand the test of time, then you can't do any of those things. You have to be really careful not to
date something. So these are all really good points for people out there who are maybe thinking about where they're going to set a story, which has a lot of impact on how you write it and how much research you have to do. Yeah. So it kind of depends on how you approach writing, what type of person you are, maybe on how you choose your location and your time and so on. And this book here was actually a more current setting.
It is.
Was it easier to write that?
In a sense, yeah. Because, I could use Google Street Map and find out what a town looked like right now, pretty much, to a degree. And so most of the places in there I hadn't ever been to. And to clarify for everybody, it's a trip across Canada. So they're leaving the west coast of Canada and driving straight across to the east coast with some detours on the way. And so I had never been to Bowen Island, which is where it starts, but I had a friend who lived there. But I had been to Lloydminster, so I used that. But I still had to research because it was years ago.
Well, think about it. The research is so much easier. The people who went before us did not have, Safari or Google
Earth.
Yeah,
right?
To do all these things, you had to just.
You have to, and things change fairly fast.
And they do.
They do, especially landmarks and locations. In this book, the restaurant that I mentioned, it closed like maybe a year or two after I wrote about it. So these things happen. So how can you find out about a restaurant that's closed 20 years ago?
There you go.
And it was not a big landmark. It wasn't anything all that important, but it was. So you just make up what you can.
I think that sometimes too people struggle with when they're thinking of writing a book, and if it's fiction, well, do they put in real places, or do you make up towns? These are all the kinds of questions that pass through people's mind, and what you have to figure out.
In this one,
you did both in that one.
Kitchener's a real place, but the town she ends up in is a fictional town. Yeah, and I did that deliberately because it was so much easier to make up a fictional town and have a fictional cove with fictional landscape than to try to remember what a particular place looked like. And, I just thought that was easier.
You're not writing history, you're writing fiction.
Right. And I was also living in Ontario when I wrote that. So I wasn't in a place where I could just say, I'll base it on, Lewisport, and I couldn't do that. I wasn't there.
Right. Now, we've got a little insight into editing. I'm sure there's so much more we could share, but how about the publishing side of it? Where did you go when you were ready to publish? What did you do?
Well, I was fortunate with the first two books, I had a small publisher out of Edmonton who I met through writing. We had the internet in 2010, not 2009. And so through a writer's group that I was involved with online, I found a publisher who first published the poetry book. And she had a very special sort of theme to the books that she was publishing. She wanted philosophical bends and themes. So that's where she wanted. So they were traditionally published. The other two I independently published. And the reason for that was time. This one I wanted before Canada 150. And I started January of that year, so there was no way that was going to end up.
That was not going to happen.
This one was a collection of short stories, and I was invited to the Fogo Island Partridge Berry Harvest Festival as their featured artist. These are very local stories, and so I wanted to bring this book to them and launch it at that festival. So I sped up the process and published that independently as well.
So that's interesting. Self-publishing can be much faster, and we know that. I mean, I've spoken with Gary Cranford with Flanker Press, and he said, you know, they know their books so far out that you can't just come in with a book and expect to have it in 6 months' time. So I think that the self-publishing opportunities have opened up a lot of avenues for writers.
I think so, and I really enjoyed the process. The marketing was all on me, but the marketing, even with these books, I mean, I sold most of the books. I did more of that than the publisher, even though they did their part, and I have no blame to that. What they did was fantastic, but I also did it too because it was my book, and I was the one that had to get out. And people buy books from people they know, or people they know recommend those books. And so the marketing can only take you so far when you're new. And so I'm very active, and I get out and I go to different events, and I put the books in front of people, and then I talk to them. And then if they want to buy a particular, I've got quite a selection so they can choose. But it's very much a personal thing, a relationship thing. Even online, you know, there's a lot of opportunity to get your books noticed online, but you still, the people that buy it are the people that you create relationships with on the internet and on social media, and they will, if they like your work, they'll come back for the rest of it. So the writer is always the best promoter of their own work, and it's very important that they do that.
Well, and it's an interesting dichotomy because writing is an isolated project. It's not something, I mean, your ideas, you're out there collecting them, but eventually they have to go into your mind and they have to come out of your hands onto your computer. So you have to, but then if you want to do the other part, to promote it, that's outgoing.
Right.
So it's interesting, and not everyone is suited to all aspects of it. Yet, I think if you self-publish, you kind of have to step up and be prepared to do, certainly to do a lot of it, but even with a traditional publisher, they still need you to be out there talking about your books. And
what I've noticed is, and we do the literary tour that you mentioned earlier, is that we had people on that tour that did maybe 4 stops, and they hated public thing, they hated reading, but they had to do it if they wanted to get there. So they did it, and I noticed a huge difference between the first time they did it and the 4th time they did it in their confidence level and their ability to, you know, say what they wanted to say. And so some of this is just practice. Like get out of your own way, you know. It's just talking to people. It's just reading from your book. You've put your heart and soul into this to let it sit on your own shelf, you know. I mean, there's nothing. I love it when people say, "Oh, I read your book," and you know, and I don't care if they like it or not. They've read it, you know, and that's what it's all about.
Well, we have not too much time left, but I do want to ask you, what do you think about reviews? What role do you think reviews play in the sales of books? Oftentimes, if people get a book, Amazon says, "Oh, give us a review." Does it hurt if someone writes a bad review? Or is it still just publicity, or how do you personally take it?
Okay, so don't get caught up in reviews. In other words, if a stranger on the internet says your book is awful, that doesn't necessarily mean it's awful. There's some awful people on the internet. And if they say it's really, really good, it doesn't mean it's necessarily really, really good, because there are people who just like any book. They just love reading, and they, you know, so just be very careful not to take it too personally. But Amazon reviews are really good for marketing because you get in their algorithm. And so the more reviews you have, it keeps them up, and so your visibility is improved. So they're important in a very practical sense in that if you have reviews and they keep coming, they really do help the author. So I'll take a 3-star review, and I'll be fine with that. And I like to have 25. And I love it when they're well written and they tell you, you know.
There are people who write fabulous reviews.
Yeah.
And they have reasons why they like the books. Well, that's really great, which kind of brings us a little bit to social media, and I assume you have all ways that people can reach you through. Tell us about your social media. How do people reach out to you, Carolyn?
I am Carolyn R. Parsons on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. I'm everywhere. If you Google Carolyn R. Parsons, Amazon has a page that author page. Everywhere. I'm easy to find.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, and you know what? We're going to have you back again for another show because there's so many things. You are out and about there in this province doing so many things to support the writing community. So I do want to have you back to talk about that because we just didn't have time today.
I would love to do that.
Thank you, and thank you so much for what you shared with us today, and all the best with your future writing, Carolyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.